Hello and welcome to 2020 Politics War Room with James Carville. I'm Al Hunt in Washington. We're proud partners with the Sign Institute at American University and can't wait to get back there. Both James and I are at home now. He's in Mississippi. We have a great guest this week, but first, don't forget to subscribe to 2020 Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcast. David Harris is a professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches criminal law and evidence. He specializes in police conduct, search and seizure law, and the intersection of race and criminal justice. He's the author of 4 books on policing. His new book, A City Divided, Race, Fear, and Law in Police Confrontations, published this year and available on Amazon and everywhere else. He's also the host of a criminal injustice podcast. David, we are so fortunate to have you on. There is nobody better to talk to about the awful incidents that have occurred this past week. Thank you for being with us. But let me just start. The Minneapolis, the Floyd tragedy, why does this keep recurring?
Glad to be with you, gentlemen, for a very sobering topic. And the reason that it keeps occurring is that we have unresolved questions within policing, and especially at the intersection of race and criminal justice. You know, it's been many, many years, decades, since the unrest in the middle of the 1960s that caused the formation of the Kerner Commission. And if you go back to that report, you will see that lots of those disturbances started with an incident of a police officer abusing, beating, or hurting a black person. This isn't new. It goes back, and we have failed to come to grips with some of the very basic problems in policing. They involve the use of force disproportionately against African Americans, and the use of force when it is frankly not necessary. This comes about, as I've said in my book, A City Divided, because we have stark racial differences in our society that we have not fully addressed, and the police are drawn from our society. And then we give them very broad powers to use force, and in many instances, we don't train them properly, and we do not hold them accountable for when things go wrong. That is the root cause of so much police misconduct, and it's why it keeps happening. We don't hold ourselves, our organizations, or our officers accountable for the damage that's caused.
Well, you know, every time something like this happens, I'm thinking of Michael Brown and other incidents before that, we say, all right, now police are going to wear body cameras, and now we're going to have more sensitivity training, and now we're going to work more. And is it just all cosmetic, or has some progress been made in some places? And what more needs to be done on the critical accountability question you just raised?
Well, some progress has been made. I mean, it's easy for me to say as a middle-aged white man that things are better. I don't face this kind of thing that people of color do, but we do have better police departments, better police training, and by and large, better officers than we did, say, 20 or 30 years ago. But not enough has been done. Body cameras have turned out to be a real mixed bag, helpful in many instances. They do put certain facts beyond dispute, but not only what can be seen on the camera itself in front of the lens. Better training is certainly helpful. Better policies are helpful, but this really lies at the bottom on police culture. The culture within police departments and culture in organizations is devilishly hard to change. You really have to have leadership that will insist on it, and then when things violate the rules that you put in place, you must hold people accountable. I hate to sound like a broken record, Al, but it really comes back to holding their feet to the fire, and up and down the entire organization, whether it's the chief or the newest patrol person. When things go wrong, you have to go back. Maybe you counsel them, maybe you discipline them, maybe you suggest they get into another line of work. And too often, law enforcement instead has circled the wagons, protected their own. They've refused to call out even the worst police officers within organizations, and they taint the entire organization with their misconduct that is tolerated. And the public sees this. They know it's there.
Let me try one more and then turn it over to James. Is there any are there any couple departments, any couple cities you'd say, boy, that's a place to look to? They really are making it work better. And how does Minneapolis rank in any ranking of good and bad?
Well, I would point to two that have made real change and great strides. You can probably remember, along with me, the LAPD of the era of the Rodney King incident. And even after that, the Rampart scandals. I mean, things didn't stop being awful there with the Rodney King incident. It continued. But a name that you'll all recognize, Bill Bratton, he was brought in to be the chief in Los Angeles. A lot of people told him, don't take the job. It's a suicide mission. But he went in there with a completely different point of view. He said, we're going to transform this department. And he met with the people who most often sued the department and with allies within it who wanted to be better. And today you have a markedly different, not flawless, but much different department. And those changes and changes in culture have outlasted Bratton's tenure and now another chief's tenure too, and they seem pretty solid. The other example I would give you would be Camden, New Jersey, a place where the police problems were really intractable. And that was a small enough department. You couldn't do this in LA or New York, but they just went in and shut it down and started a brand new department from scratch out of officers from their county. And they have a good police department now. It is one of the best small to medium-sized departments in the country. How did Minneapolis rank in there? Well, they'd made some progress. But as those who were doing actual training by outsiders in Minneapolis will tell you, they had obviously not gotten far enough. And you still had officers within the ranks who had not been held accountable for misconduct. There had still been incidents in which not enough was done, and you see the results.
So Prof, let me tell you, as I see the culture problem. Bob Kroll, Kroll, is the head of the Fraternal Order of FOP in Minneapolis, 800 officers. All right, Bob Kroll appears at Trump rallies. I think if you look at the Wikipedia, it's generous to say he's had multiple incidences of excessive force. But there's a word to describe Bob Kroll, and that word is elected. All right? The police officers themselves collectively decided this is who they want to represent them. I think that's a frightful expression of the culture in the Minneapolis Police Department.
I think you're making a really, really important point. I get asked about police unions a lot, and Mr. Kroll is with the police union. He's the leader of the police union up there. We have an FOP unit here in Pittsburgh where I live. It's FOP Lodge number 1, which tells you something about them. And in many places, unions have taken the position that they will protect even their worst officers. And there is your real big problem with accountability and misconduct. They take often in some FOP lodges very extreme positions. I don't know about anybody here in Pittsburgh appearing at a Trump rally, but I do know that the union is seen by Pittsburgh residents, where I live, as controlling the police department. I'm not against unions. I am not against unions. I think fighting for good wages and working conditions is the right of every American, and we should see more of it. But what I am against are unions that protect the worst people in their ranks who have to have contact with the public. And that's what I think goes on there. You also have some unions like this one up in Minneapolis where there's a lot of rabble-rousing around very negative stereotypes of the public. I mean, you can just tell that they don't respect the people they serve when these union people are talking. I don't mean every member of the union. I mean people like Mr. Kroll. And I've seen that time and again. That sends the message to people, we care about us. It's us against you. Until these things change, James, we're going to have a big problem. Part of the problem here is that big cities have given away the disciplinary process in whole or in part to the unions by putting mandatory arbitration in that guarantees for a lot of bad police officers that they can get fired and get their jobs back. This has got to change. These collective bargaining agreements that protect bad officers are no good for the public, and they're no good for all the good officers either.
Well, they could start by electing better people to represent them. But what happened here, I think, is there's been a 20% spike in public relations with reference to police violence toward minorities. And the thing that this George Floyd thing did is, I think it really affected whites, because whites were like, somebody who studies it obviously knows what's going on, but a lot of people were, yeah, I know it's happening, it's terrible, but it's just kind of the way the world is. And when you actually saw it, you could almost people having this collective, like, oh shit, I didn't know it was like this. And and it really affected. I think minority saw it and says, well, yeah, what's new here? And you had an entirely different reaction, and not just from uber liberal people, but I mean even to the point where you had Rush Limbaugh go on, Charlemagne.
Yeah, I think I could not agree more with you, James. I mean, something about seeing a recording of a human being killed right in front of you as people called out, help him, get off of his neck, he can't breathe, and he called out for his own life. Something about seeing that, I think, has reached people in ways that it would not if there was just a report on the television or a bulletin on the radio. It was impossible to turn away from unless you just insisted on burying your head in the sand. You could not say that this was right. And one of the signs of that is you saw no law enforcement organizations, except maybe Mr. Kroll, no head of a police department or police organization, professional organization, coming out and saying, let's just wait here. This officer was just doing the right thing. It doesn't look good. I mean, that's the kind of thing we would hear sometimes, and you know that. But we didn't hear that. And I think that's the reason it reached people at that level.
I mean, it's really had a real effect on public opinion. Now, how long it lasts, quite another thing. If Biden called you in and he was president-elect, and he said, look, Prof, give me three things. I know we got to change the economic inequality, and I know I got to do that. But what are three things I can do as president to make this better in the immediate term? What would you tell him?
Well, I would tell him that there are a lot of police leaders, a lot of chiefs, a lot of leadership in police departments around the country that know what needs to be done and want to do it, but they've been kind of hamstrung. So I would tell him first to bring those people into the White House and have a large gathering and say, we're going to do better. These people in back of me, they want to do better, and here are the things we're going to do. So you start with a gathering that will convene again that is all targeted at this. And the playbook is there. This was President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force. So we know what needs to be done. We got to move from the warrior-style policing that has been dominant in American police departments for the last 25 years. The idea that it's a war out there and the police are out defending us in a war or an insurgency. That has got to go. That has got to be replaced by a style of policing and a method of policing that is all about guarding the public peace and establishing partnerships. We know how to do that, and the federal government can support it with money, with grants, with all kinds of initiatives. Number two, you got to put the mechanics in place for an even more robust effort to change police departments that can't or won't change through federal legal action. We saw a pretty good effort under the Obama administration's Civil Rights Division. It's got to be more intense. There's got to be more of it. Even at any one time, that kind of effort never reached more than 15 or 20 of the worst police departments. It's got to be something where we go all out. Number three, he would have to pledge himself to supporting changes in state law on the use of force, because use of force is governed for the most part by state law. There's a big Supreme Court decision that lays down the basic rules, but don't look for any changes there. States, though, can do better for their citizens. We saw California pass a bill like that, and other states could do it too. And he should voice his support for that very thing. And number four, you only gave me three, but I'm going to take a fourth one. Number four, he has to come out and say, we're going to build a federal infrastructure for police accountability. This will be structures that the police department in any city or town can take off the shelf, put in place, and use, courtesy of the federal government. And it will be national databases that track police misconduct, police complaints, and police decertification, so we can get rid of the worst officers.
David, you bring up state law because I was going to ask you, why is it so hard to convict cops in these sort of incidents? I mean, I cannot believe they can't get a conviction in Minneapolis. You couldn't ask for more proof. But I think probably correctly, the charge they brought was third degree because it's almost impossible to prove intent. But generally, in a lot of other places, I think the vast majority of cases that go to trial, the police officer is acquitted.
Well, it's true, Al, and I think people are really mystified by that. Let me break it down. Under state law, you got that Supreme Court decision that I mentioned to deal with. You have a lot of prosecutors reluctant to bring charges against police because they work hand in glove with those departments. And then you have the fundamentals of the law and our culture. What I mean by that is that law, that Supreme Court case called Graham versus Connor from the 80s, basically says you have to view the police officer's actions not with hindsight, not through your civilian eyes, but through the eyes of an objectively reasonable police officer. And, said the Supreme Court, you've got to look at it knowing that police officers are often in dangerous situations and have to make split-second decisions. Now, if that's the law, if that's what you're going to hold them to, it's going to be difficult under the best circumstances to convict a police officer. When you add to that the fact that most civilians, not all, and it may become less common, but most civilians give police officers the benefit of the doubt when they're in court, and look for reasons to acquit, and you add the fear that most people feel of black men, and the social science on this is devastating when you read it. They're looking for excuses oftentimes to acquit police officers because when the guy who got shot is a scary black man, I mean, that's why these things go wrong, and that's why acquittals are so common. I mean, think of that case in South Carolina, Walter Scott. The man is running away.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, he's running away. He's running as fast as he can, opposite direction, nothing in his hands, and that officer takes a stance and shoots him in the back. And yet, you had a South Carolina jury would not convict. He only went to prison because he was given a kind of sweetheart plea deal by the feds. So these are always tough cases to get convictions on. That's why we need to change that use of force law at the state level. That could have an impact.
Well, I know that most police officers are really law-abiding, good citizens. We all need them. They protect us all. But Robert O'Brien, the president's national security advisor, I have no idea why he's talking about this, says, hey, there's just a few bad apples. Is it that easy?
No, it's not. And that bad apple thing, that is really unhelpful, just to put it as mildly as I can. It's not a question of a few bad apples. That's what we've heard for years. It's a question of, if you'd let me twist the metaphor a little bit, bad apple barrels. Okay? So yes, you might have some officers who are not good and most of the others are, but it's the culture and the organization that allows those people to set the tone for the entire group. that allows them to set a very low standard of conduct when they misbehave and they're not disciplined, they're not fired. And everybody within the department knows who those officers are. I've never been in a department to do training or anything else where everybody wasn't completely aware of who that 4, 5, 10% was. And yet we don't do anything about them. So it's not bad apples. It's the bad apple barrel that doesn't take care of these problems. And that ultimately hurts not just the department itself, of course, but it hurts the public. And then every once in a while, one of those people ends up creating a real catastrophe like George Floyd's death.
You know, I just had this thought. These Dirty Harry movies where the rogue cop was the hero and the police chief was the buffoon and he didn't pay attention to it. And I think that they have had some effect on culture and the way that the white public looks at some of this.
I agree with you, James. I mean, it goes all the way back to Dirty Harry, doesn't it? It's that sort of social image as the police are supposed to protect us, and they're a bunch of ineffectual people who do things like follow the law, and they do things like cut breaks to defendants because they're of something called the Constitution. We don't need that. We need police who will stand up and be brutal when necessary. That's a terrible, terrible set of messages, but sadly, it appeals to a certain group of people and always has. We have to insist on our values as we go into whether we're talking about policing in the real world or we're just talking about our country generally. We must insist that real American values of law, equality, and justice apply to everybody. And, as a great sage said a long time ago, if 10 or 100 guilty people have to go free in order that the innocent shall be protected, that's okay. That's okay. We have to insist that we're going to live as what our Constitution says about us and who we aspire to be. Dirty Harry is a cartoon of some of the worst attitudes that are out there. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I understand the appeal of the movie, but this shouldn't be real life.
Yeah, who wants the heroic rogue cop, the buffoon mayor, and the bureaucratic police chief who sits at his desk and doesn't know what it's like out there. It's entertaining, but it just over and over, people develop this affection for the rogue cop in the locker room.
David, you have done seminal work on racial profiling. 2 questions: how important is that in this whole police community race issue, and has it gotten any better?
It is important, I would argue, Al, because it is one of the tactics that has rankled and has touched so many African Americans and other people of color. There's no more common experience in the United States, no more ubiquitous experience than driving in a vehicle. And there is no more common setting for police contact. It is the most common setting, according to the data, that people have in which they might have contact with police. And when certain people get picked out over and over and over, for baloney stuff like, your tail lights out, you don't have your sticker, you went 2 miles an hour over the speed limit. I mean, they know what that's about. It's not a surprise to them because it keeps happening to them. Profiling can show up in other contexts too, such as stop and frisk. I mean, there's nothing illegal about stopping cars for traffic offenses, and there's nothing illegal about stop and frisk itself. But what is wrong with these things is when they're used with a racial overlay. Number one, as I've argued in my book about profiling, Profiles and Injustice, it actually doesn't help you catch bad guys. It makes your results worse. So if you wanted to be the most effective cop, you would not do this. But more importantly, it just leaves a mark on people. People understand, even in these low-level incidents that happen to them, that the law doesn't apply to them in the same way that it applies to everybody else. That the police force is not there for them. It's there to do things to them. It's there to control them. And it's terribly, terribly damaging. And of course, little things like that can add up. You can get a suspended license, then you can't get to work, and it has real consequences. Is it getting better? I do think it's better than it was, 25 years ago when I began laboring in that particular vineyard. I don't think it's gone by any means, but we have much more of a consciousness among police and, of course, in the public that this isn't right, and it's got to be tamed. And most importantly, we've got to be collecting data on this, because the data tells the tale. When you get the data, you can see if this is a problem with one officer in an entire department. And then, of course, you got to do something about it.
Well, David, I must tell you, in a very emotional week, tragedy that has beset the country, first in Minneapolis, and then with some of these demonstrations, most of which, overwhelming majority, I think, are very, very heartfelt. I just hope that a new administration and police chiefs all over America will listen to David Harris, because you have really brought light in a very difficult time. James and I are very appreciative of your time.
Excellent. Great points.
Boy, I learned a lot from that.
I really did.
I mean, maybe more than I read in the papers the last couple of days combined. I mean, it's just, what the problem is, what needs to be done, all the way to, I wish if it weren't for the pandemic, I'd go up to Camden, New Jersey tomorrow, which I know. I grew up near Camden. It's a really, really home of Jersey Joe Walcott in a really impoverished town. And the fact that they have done so well, and there was that sheriff out in Genesee County, Michigan, who the protesters came to the police station, and he came outside and he threw his guns to the side and he said, "Here, I'm marching with you." More police officers like that, as opposed to the guy in Minneapolis, we'd be making progress.
Yeah, again, I just make the distressing point that that guy was elected.
Yeah.
The police chief
Yep.
was appointed. And he
Yep.
was elected because, I hate to say this, but it was probably the manifestation of the culture.
I'm afraid you're right, and it has to change. Let's turn to politics, if we can, something that we have talked about from time to time. Donald Trump this week walks out of the White House, surrounded by security, as always, marches across Lafayette Park. It's filled with demonstrators who, at the direction of the Attorney General, police have scattered, using tear gas on some. Trump walks all alone for the camera shot for a while, a la Duke Wayne, and then he has his posse behind him. They go up to this church, which has been shut down, a historic church, St. John's, been shut down because of a fire the night before, and he summons all the sycophants to come up, and he holds up a Bible. You have arranged probably a lot of photo shots in your day. How does this one rate?
Well, first of all, the only thing that's surprising is that we would be surprised at anything he does.
Right.
Right? And, of course, he holds up the Bible, which it's backwards, everything about it. And you got these preachers and these Republicans trying to justify this. I mean, that's the only thing that is marginally entertaining is to watch the painful justifications that Republicans go through for Trump's behavior. It's becoming to be almost entertaining. It really is.
I agree. I thought, we have from time to time said, all right, this is it. This one is the worst I've ever seen since he's been president. And there were so many awful sidebars to this, one of which the Washington Post captured in a story on Wednesday morning. Apparently, a lot of this was the idea of his daughter, Ivanka, and she's marching with him across. There are a lot of protesters out there. Terrible things have happened to America. There's great trauma. And she's marching across, carrying her designer handbag and wearing pearls. And she and Jared Kushner have got to be the model. We've criticized White House relatives before. They have got to be the model of nepotistic misfits. They really are as bad as it gets.
Yep. I mean, but we should not be surprised.
Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. But the other thing that he counts on, I think, James, is that we're not surprised, so we pass over it. Not that we don't condemn it. We do, but then we move on. You can't remember. I mean, I just noticed this week several television reports, perfectly fine reports. We talk about Joe Biden and say, well, Joe Biden now is talking about race. This is in the context of what he said last week when he misspoke to a radio host and said that if you vote Republican, you ain't black. It wasn't the smartest thing in the world to say, but it wasn't a really big faux pas compared to what Trump does every day. But he does it so much that it all gets lost. It's what somebody years ago called future shock. And I guess that's why he gets away with some of it.
You know what J.C. Watts' daddy said? He was a Baptist preacher in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
He said a black person voting for a Republican is like a chicken voting for Colonel Sanders. All right? And all right, that's what he said. You can look it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason you laugh is because there's so much truth to it. But one thing that I hope that this really motivates non-white under 35s in these swing states to vote. I hope that there's a reaction, and that is a group of people that if they got politically motivated, they could make a real difference because their participation rates have tended to be very low. And to the extent that you can, these are some really valuable Democratic voters.
Yeah, I agree. You cited earlier some of the right-wing evangelicals who aren't offended by anything that Trump does and praised him. But I think, on the other hand, there were some religious leaders who really rose to the occasion. I thought the Episcopal bishop really put the wood to him. I suppose people aren't surprised. That's has a reputation as a very liberal denomination. But the Archbishop of Washington, the Catholic Archbishop of Washington, was just outraged that he used a church venue for political purposes and really let him have it. And moreover, James, the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Russell Moore, who is one of the really honest evangelical conservatives, just said that the use of the Bible as a prop is outrageous. There are some really, really admirable people who aren't tolerating these kind of gambits.
They are, and but you look at the some that do, and I think who the Archbishop Gregory was going after was the Knights of Columbus, which is run by Jesse Helms' acolyte. So if you can imagine the view of the Knights of Columbus towards certain demographic, we'll leave it at that.
I mentioned Biden earlier, James. He had a number of interviews this week, and he gave a speech in Philadelphia. My impression in watching some of those interviews and in watching the speech, it was one of the better weeks he's ever had. He really, really looked good. He was measured. At the same time being tough on Trump, but also trying to call on Americans to unify in these difficult times. I thought it was really I hate this expression, it was a presidential type speech.
I think I agree. And weirdly enough, I don't think that Reagan or Clinton or Obama could have done any better in that situation. It was called for was really Joe Biden. Years of experience, the trust that people have in him, the kind of decency about him. And it just came across, it wasn't full of soaring rhetoric, and it wasn't if not us, who, not now, when, any of that. And I give him a lot of credit for what he did, and I give him as much for what he didn't do. He came from the heart, and he didn't try too hard. And it was just the right tone.
I think you got it exactly right. He didn't let Trump off the hook. He really went after Trump in a very effective and I think very direct and very honest way. But that wasn't the whole speech. If the speech had just been how awful Trump has been, which he has been during this great trauma, and how he fails us in a time when we need to unify this country, that'd have been a political speech. That'd have been, okay, I suppose. But he did much more than that. 2/3 of the speech was exactly what you said. He's never going to engage in soaring rhetoric. That's not what Joe is. But he showed a sincerity, a clarity of purpose and vision and ideals that I think really, really resonated.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. So it was a good week for Joe Biden. There were also a number of elections. Didn't, as far as the presidential race was concerned, didn't much matter. He won a number of other primaries, but they at this stage are irrelevant. He's going to be the nominee in August. There were a couple that were interesting, and I suppose more than any place else, it was a couple in Iowa. One which was good news for the Republicans, Steve King, the vitriolic right-wing congressman who's caused them such embarrassment, was defeated in a primary. My guess is that Republicans were delighted and Democrats not so delighted because they thought they could beat Steve King in the fall. And the other result in Iowa that didn't get as much attention, but that matters, was a Senate Democratic primary where the preferred candidate for most Democrats that are looking at that race was Teresa Greenfield, and she won handily over a Des Moines registered candidate. Doesn't have to have a runoff. She's going to be a tough opponent for Joni Ernst in the fall.
Yeah. No, and the turnout was like Boffo good, according to the reports I heard. You know?
Yeah.
No, Iowa's, she's no worse than 50-50. She's really not.
And she's not one of their top 3 or 4 pickups, likely pickups. I mean, there are probably at least 3 or 4 places that are more likely.
Well, four, North Carolina, Arizona, to Colorado, and Maine.
Yeah, yeah.
They're actually, in my view, over 50% Democratic.
Right.
And I would put Montana and Iowa, Texas, and Georgia, which is, we talked about Georgia last week, and I got a little bit convoluted. But it's actually possible that you would have 2 Senate elections in Georgia in January. Because the Purdue seat is just the way you do it. There's going to be a Democratic primary in Ossoff, who ran for the 6th district seat special, and Teresa Tomlinson, who's the Democratic mayor of Columbus, are the 2 leading Democratic candidates. They're going to have a primary this summer. And then they will vote on election day for that seat in November. But there's a Libertarian candidate. And in Georgia, if you don't get 50% on election day, so somebody gets 49.9, you have a runoff. And that has happened. That is possible. You're definitely going to have a runoff in the other race because that's the Kelly Loeffler seat, the Johnny Isaacson seat, where Doug Collins will probably beat Loeffler already. And then it's going to be between, in that instance, it's going to be Reverend Warnock or a guy named Travis, who's a highly respected lawyer from Augusta. The top 2 will run off in January. In both of those seats, to pick up one of them is not an unrealistic hope. I shy away from the word expectation now, but it's certainly realistic to hope we could win one of those Senate seats.
Well, this is one of those few areas where we have a slight disagreement. I think Democrats have done a really good job in recruiting good candidates, persuading Steve Bullock to run, Teresa Greenfield in Iowa, Sarah Gideon up in Maine. I don't think there's a strong Democrat in that field. And you're right. One of those 2 seats at least should be won. And if Stacey Abrams hadn't decided she was too big to run for the Senate, or if they had persuaded, I don't know, Sally Yates or someone else. So I hope you're right, but mark me down as skeptical in Georgia.
I mean, I've said hope. I didn't say expectation.
You did.
And by the way, Purdue is not he's got some issues to deal with. He's not the greatest incumbent you ever ran against. And, Doug Collins Trump is not that popular in Georgia. He's probably, if anything, below 50.
Oh, yeah. He's below 50 in favorability. And because the polls show it virtually even down there between Biden and Trump.
So the candidate would help some, but this election is going to be all about Trump. There's really not much else that people are going to vote on other than attitudes on Trump. I mean, they're not going to vote on the minimum wage or, this is not what's driving this at all.
Yeah.
Trump is driving everything.
Yeah, he is, and he will continue to, and he will continue to because he's a man who's desperate, James. And if he does things that are untoward in normal times when he's desperate, we can only imagine what he's going to do.
The Georgia Republican poll
Uh-huh.
in Trump's favorability among college white women is 12%. Right? The only people that think that the Democrats don't have a chance in Georgia are the Democrats. The Republicans definitely think the Democrats have a chance in Georgia. You couldn't find a single Republican consultant that wouldn't tell you, damn, man, I don't like the way this is going. None.
Before we go, let's do a little bit of a back page. You're still down in Mississippi. Anything interesting this week?
Well, actually, for the moment, I'm in Louisiana, but
New Orleans, okay.
Yeah, but I'm going out. It's not very far apart. Interesting this week. Well, no, except for it's June the 3rd, and there's a storm coming our way.
Yeah.
The third named storm, and then you have a really big storm in India and Mumbai coming, and the water temperatures are distressingly high everywhere. I cannot emphasize enough that this is going to be a very challenging hurricane season in very challenging times. And if I tell you I had any hope that we'd have an adequate federal response, I'd be lying.
Oh, and if the pandemic is still a threat, which it likely will be, my God, can you imagine?
Can you imagine that? And then you're having the people hoarded into shelters.
If you have to evacuate a reasonable sized city, where do you go?
I don't know. Let's say Miami has to evacuate.
Oh.
Or Houston, or New Orleans, or Norfolk, or Charleston. All right, any of those. It could be Baltimore. But you don't know. But if you look at a place where you have these big evacuations, the worst case scenario, Miami, it'd be that storm come up the coast, be a mess. And the water temperatures are just disgustingly high in the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, it's going to be a mess, I promise you. Like anybody else, well, I hope no one gets it, but I hope we don't get it more than anybody else. We don't want it. We don't need it.
Well, you're going to have to come back to the Shenandoah for a while, James.
I'm going. Yeah. I cannot. I can't ride out a hurricane.
Well, I don't have a lot of good news to offset that. I did finish last weekend. I think you have to Eric Larson's great book, The Splendid and the Vile Church.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, anyone who hadn't read it, James, I tell you, I finished it like 504 pages, and I don't want it to end. I want to keep going. I want to find out. Go to 1942. And I read a number of Churchill biographies, but in a very, very personal way. This brought it home as well as any. And my God. And the other thing I thought was when you had someone like Harry Hopkins, FDR's closest confidant, going over at Britain's time of great peril and being able to spend 3 weeks with the Prime Minister of Great Britain and really forging and putting together the beginnings of an alliance with Lend-Lease and others that helped save Britain. I couldn't imagine someone doing that in this White House, but that goes without saying. The only other news I have is not great news, I guess. For the first time in my life, James, for the first time in my life, I was a fat cat. I made my first campaign contribution, $50, to a former student and Obama White House aide, Jordan Grossman, who was running for city council. God, he is a smart, terrific young man, going to make a real difference in public policy in this country. And I was a fat cat, and he didn't quite make it. So I think I'm gonna retire as a political sugar daddy, I think.
As a donor?
Yeah, you'll hear from Jordan Grossman again, though.
Put the updates in here for me. All right, that was a great show.
It
That
was
guy was
it was a great show, and it was in a very difficult time. We learned a lot, and I really enjoyed it. I mean that in the best sense of the word.
I go back that thing at St. John's. That's got to be, even I got to admit, anybody that tries to understand the depths of his rottenness, you can't imagine it. You really can't.
Oh,
I mean, in the expression on his face.
I'll tell you, it personified evil. It just personified evil. It was using a religious institution that had been harmed badly the night before, a great church, using it for political purposes, holding up the Bible, which he's probably never opened in his life, bringing along the simpering sycophants, his daughter orchestrating much of it, tear gassing peaceful protesters. How can it get worse? But it will.
It will. We promise you that. It will get worse.
All right, James Carville, you stay safe this week.
On that optimistic note.
You stay safe, and I'm looking forward to talking to you. Actually, I'm looking forward to talking to you probably this afternoon. But I'm looking forward to talking to you on this podcast in another week, okay?
You bet. Great show.
Hey, thank you for subscribing, and please tell your friends that the Ragin' Cajun and Albert Hunt are talking politics and a whole lot more each week. We'd love to welcome all of you new listeners, and we appreciate all those who've been with us since the beginning. We'll talk to you again next week. Be safe.